Midwinter day. He was woken by music. It beckoned him, lilting and insistent. Delicate music, played by delicate instruments that he could not identify, with one rippling bell-like phrase running through it in a gold thread of delight. There was in this music so much of the deepest enchantment of all his dreams and imaginings that he woke smiling in pure happiness at the sound. In the moment of his waking it began to fade, beckoning as it went, and then he opened his eyes. It was gone. He had only the memory of that one rippling phrase still echoing in his head, and itself fading so fast that he sat up abruptly in bed and reached his arm out to the air as if he could bring it back. The room was very still, and there was no music, and yet Will knew that it had not been a dream. He was in the twins' room still. He could hear Robin's breathing, slow and deep, from the other bed. Cold light glimmered round the edge of the curtains, but no one was stirring anywhere. It was very early. Will pulled up his rumpled clothes from the day before and slipped out of the room. He crossed the landing to the central window, and looked down. It was in the first shining moment he saw the whole strange, familiar world, glistening white, the roofs of the outbuildings mounded into square towers of snow, and beyond them all the fields and hedges buried, merged into one great flat expanse, unbroken white to the horizon's brim. Will drew in a long, happy breath, silently rejoicing. Then, very faintly, he heard the music again, the same phrase. He swung round, vainly searching for it in the air, as if he might see it somewhere, like a flickering light. "Where are you?" It had gone again, and when he looked back through the window, he saw that his own world had gone with it. In that flash, everything had changed. The snow was there as it had been a moment before, but not piled now on roofs or stretching flat over the lawns and fields. There were no roofs. There were no fields. There were only trees. Will was looking over a great white forest, a forest of massive trees, sturdy as towers and ancient as rock. They were bare of leaves, clad only in the deep snow that lay untouched along every branch, each smallest twig. They were everywhere. They began to close to the house that he was looking out through. They began so close to the house that he was looking out through the topmost branches of the nearest tree, could have reached out and shaken them if he had dared to open the window. All around him the trees stretched to the flat horizon of the valley. The only break in that white world of branches was away over to the south, where the Thames ran. He could see the bend in the river, marked like a single stilled wave in the white ocean of forest, and the shape of it looked as though the river were wider than it should have been. Will gazed and gazed, and when at last he stirred, he found that he was clutching the smooth iron circle threaded onto his belt. The iron was warm to the touch. He went back into the bedroom. "Robin!" he said loudly. "Wake up!" But Robin breathed slowly and rhythmically as before and did not stir. He ran to the bedroom next door, the familiar small room that he had once shared with James, and shook James roughly by the shoulder. But when the shaking was done, James lay motionless, deeply asleep. Will went out onto the landing and took a long breath, and he shouted with all his might, "Wake up! Wake up, everyone!" He did not now expect any response, and none came. There was a total silence, as deep and timeless as the blanketing snow. The house and everyone in it lay in a sleep that would not be broken. Will went downstairs to pull on his boots and the old sheepskin jacket that had belonged before him to 2 or 3 of his brothers in turn. Then he went out to the back door, closing it quietly behind him, and stood looking out through the quick white vapor of his breath. The strange white world lay stroked by silence. No birds sang. The garden was no longer there. In this forested land, there were no outbuildings, nor were the outbuildings, nor the old crumbling walls. There lay only a narrow clearing round the house now, hummocked in unbroken snowdrifts before the trees began, with a narrow path leading away. Will set out down the white tunnel of the path, slowly stepping high to keep the snow out of his boots. As soon as he moved away from the house, he felt very much alone, and he made himself go on without looking back over his shoulder, because he knew that when he looked, he would find that the house was gone too. He accepted everything that came into his mind without thought or question, as if he were moving through a dream, but a deeper part of him knew that he was not dreaming. He was crystal clear awake, in a midwinter day that had been waiting for him to wake into it since the day he had been born, and he somehow knew, for centuries before that, tomorrow will be beyond imagining. Will came out of the white arched path into the road, paved smooth with snow and edged everywhere by the great trees, and he looked up between the branches and saw a single black rook flap slowly past, high in the early sky. Turning to the right, he walked up the narrow road that in his own time was called Huntercombe Lane. It was the way that he and James had taken to Dawson's farm, the same road that he had trodden almost every day of his life. But it was very different now. Now, it was no more than a track through the forest, great snow-burdened trees enclosing it on both sides. Will moved bright-eyed and watchful through the silence until suddenly he heard a faint noise ahead of him. He stood still. The sound came again through the muffling trees, a rhythmical off-key tapping like a hammer striking metal. It came in short, irregular bursts, as though someone were hammering nails. As he stood listening, the world around him seemed to brighten a little. The woods seemed less dense, the snow glittered, and when he looked upward, the strip of sky over Huntercombe Lane was a clear blue. He realized that the sun had risen at last out of the sullen bank of gray cloud. He trudged on toward the sound of hammering, and soon came to a clearing. There was no village of Huntercombe any more, only this. All his senses sprang to life at once. Under a shower of unexpected sounds, sights, smells, he saw 2 or 3 low stone buildings thick-roofed with snow. He saw blue wood smoke rising and smelt it too, and smelt at the same time a voluptuous scent of new-baked bread that brought the water springing to his mouth. He saw that the nearest of the 3 buildings was 3-walled, open to the track, with a yellow fire burning inside like a captive sun. Great showers of sparks were spraying out from an anvil where a man was hammering. Beside the anvil stood a tall black horse, a beautiful gleaming animal. Will had never seen a horse so splendidly midnight in color, with no white markings anywhere. The horse raised its head and looked full at him, pawed the ground, and gave a low whinny. The smith's voice rumbled in protest, and another figure moved out of the shadows behind the horse. Will's breath came faster at the sight of him, and he felt a hollowness in his throat. He did not know why. The man was tall and wore a dark cloak that fell straight like a robe. His hair, which grew low over his neck, shone with a curious reddish tinge. He patted the horse's neck, murmuring in its ear. Then he seemed to sense the cause of its restlessness, and he turned and saw Will. His arms dropped abruptly. He took a step forward and stood there, waiting. The brightness went out of the snow and the sky, and the morning darkened a little, as an extra layer of the distant cloud bank swallowed the sun. Will crossed the road through the snow, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. He did not look at the tall cloaked figure facing him. Instead, he stared resolutely at the other man, bent again over the anvil, and realized that he knew him. It was one of the men from Dawson's farm, John Smith, old George's son. "Morning, John," he said. The broad-shouldered man in the leather apron glanced up. He frowned briefly, then nodded in welcome. "Eh, Will, you're out early." "It's my birthday," Will said. "A midwinter birthday," said the strange man in the cloak. I'm going to do that voice again. "A midwinter birthday," said the strange man in the cloak. "Auspicious indeed. And you will be 11 years grown." It was a statement, not a question. Now Will had to look. Bright blue eyes went with the red-brown hair, and the man spoke in a curious accent that was not of the southeast. "That's right," Will said. A woman came out of one of the nearby cottages, carrying a basket of small loaves of bread, and with them the new-baked smell that had so tantalized Will before. He sniffed, his stomach reminding him that he had eaten no breakfast. The red-haired man took a loaf, wrenched it apart, and held out a half toward him. "Here, you're hungry. Break your birthday fast with me, young Will." He bit into the remaining half of the loaf, and Will heard the crust crackle invitingly. He reached forward, but as he did so, the smith swung a hot horseshoe out of his fire and clapped it briefly on the hoof clenched between his knees. There was a quick, smoky smell of burning, killing the scent of the new bread, and then the shoe was back in the fire, the smith peering at the hoof. The black horse stood patiently, unmoving, but Will stepped back, dropping his arm. "No, thank you," he said. The man shrugged, tearing wolfishly at his bread, and the woman, her face invisible, behind the edge of an enveloping shawl, went away again with her basket. John Smith swung the horseshoe out of the fire, to sizzle and steam in a bucket of water. Get on," said the rider irritably, raising his head. "The day grows. How much longer?" "Your iron will not be hurried," said the smith, but he was hammering the shoe in place now with quick, sure strokes. "Done!" he said at last, trimming the hoof with a knife. The red-haired man led his horse round, tightened the girths, and slid upwards, quick as a jumping cat, into the saddle. Towering there, with the folds of his dark robe flowing over the flanks of the black horse, he looked like a statue carved out of night. But the blue eyes were staring compellingly down at Will. "Come on, boy. I'll take you where you want to go. Riding is the only way, in snow as thick as this." "No, thank you," Will said. "I am out to find the walker." He heard his own words with amazement. So that's it, he thought. "But now the rider is abroad," the man said, and all in one quick movement he twitched his horse's head around, bent in the saddle, and made a sweeping grab at Will's arm. Will jerked sideways, but he would have been seized if the smith, standing in the open wall of the forge, had not leapt forward and dragged him out of reach. For so broad a man, he moved with astonishing speed. The midnight stallion reared, and the cloaked rider was almost thrown. He shouted in fury, then recovered himself and sat looking down in a cold contemplation that was more terrible than rage. "That was a foolish move, my friend Smith," he said softly. "We shall not forget." Then he swung the stallion round and rode out in the direction from which Will had come, and the hoofs of his great horse made only a muffled whisper in the snow. John Smith spat derisively and began hanging up his tools. "Thank you," Will said. "I hope—" He stopped. "They can do me no harm," the smith said. "I come from the wrong breed for that, and in this time I belong to the road, as my craft belongs to all who use the road. Their power can work no harm on the road through Hunter's Combe. Remember that for yourself." The dream state flickered, and Will felt his thoughts begin to stir. "John," he said, "I know it's true I must find the walker, but I don't know why. Will you tell me?" The smith turned and looked directly at him for the first time with a kind of compassion in his withered face. "Ah, no, young Will. Are you so newly awake that you must learn for yourself? Ah, no, young Will. Are you so newly awake that you must learn for yourself? And much more this your first day." "First day?" said Will.